Research Colloquium, where just about every week we present researchers either from Boston University or across the world that are looking at China's global economic engagement. This is one of the signature programs of our Global China initiative here at the Global Development Policy Center, which looks at China's global economic, social, and environmental footprint. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me just tell you about a few other things that we have coming in the next week or so. Tomorrow morning, we are going, this afternoon, I should start with, our Human Capital Initiative will feature Alicia Carolyn Holland, professor at Harvard University, and she'll be giving a talk called Creative Construction, How Bureaucrats Build and Stop Infrastructure in Latin America. Tomorrow morning, I'm excited to announce that we will be launching a new interactive database on China's global power plants around the world. The new database is called China's Global Power Plants, and I'll be joined by my colleagues here at the GDP Center, Cecilia Hahn Springer and Sinwei Ma. We'll talk about some of the major findings, how we came up with this database, and then Sinwei will walk folks through how to use it and engage with it and download the data openly. Next week's colloquium, we'll have Victoria Chong-Ching, who is a PhD student at University of Southern California and a pre-doctoral fellow here at the GDP Center this semester. And then on November 10th, Tuesday, November 10th, that's getting out there a little bit, but it's going to come quicker than you thought. We're going to feature Henrik Saleen from the GDP Center's Land Use and Livelihoods initiative. Henrik has a new book from MIT Press called Mercury Stories: Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element, and we'll be launching that book on November 10th. Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back and welcome James Sundquist to the colloquium. James is a PhD student in political science at Yale University, studying China's global political economy in comparative perspective. I say welcome back because James was one of our exemplary master's students in our international relations program here at the Pardee School before we went on to Yale. And now we're proud to have him as a GDP Center Global China Fellow. James's talk will be called, Does China Offer Bailouts? The way these seminars go, we ask the presenter to speak for 25-30 minutes or so, and then we open it up to have a global conversation. If you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little Q&A button. And please, first and foremost, say your name and your affiliation so we can get to know each other. It's a little, the Zoom seminar world can be impersonal, and we want to make it as personal as possible. And then type your question in there. And after James goes through his presentation, I'll take clusters of 3 or 4 of these questions and ask them to James, and we can do a few rounds of those before we stop in the hour. So good morning to some of you, good afternoon to some of you, good evening to some of you. And I need to say sorry to some others of you. We've been getting a lot of friendly fire from people in California and the West Coast that we make them get up too early for this. I should say, before the COVID crisis, this was a 3 o'clock seminar that on a good day would bring in about 25 people from around the Boston area. But now we've decided to make these global, and wanted to, since these are about China, we wanted to make sure that we could invite and have conversations with people from China, which is why it's so early in the morning. So that makes it pretty doable for folks in Europe and Africa, a little doable for folks in Asia, as long as they're up to staying up late, but sorry for you folks in California. And next week's speaker, Victoria Chong, is going to be getting up pretty early and drinking a lot of coffee before her presentation. Without further ado, let me hand it over to James Sundquist. Really excited to hear your presentation, James. I'll let you take it away.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, thanks, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to be back at Boston University, and a real honor to be speaking to this audience that's, drawing from all around the globe, from academia and from policy. As Kevin mentioned, I started my journey at Boston University, where I studied international relations, economics, and Chinese. Then there was an interlude where I went to China, spent a total of 2 years, and I'm currently on the back half of my PhD at Yale studying political science. And today I'll be sharing with you a part of my dissertation titled, Does China Offer Bailouts? Now, everyone here, sorry, okay, I have to click to advance the slides. We're all here because we're interested in developing a deeper understanding of China's lending and construction boom that's been going on, since before the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, before it was rebranded. It's been going on for at least about 15 years now. And I've included this cartoon from the Financial Times. It got the spirit of many perceptions of China without being too distasteful. The idea that these connections of infrastructure projects and loans are going to extend China's influence. Is someone trying to, I hear a few noises. Okay, I think it's just an echo. I wasn't sure if someone was trying to get my attention. So you have these charges that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy. And you also hear that China is offering bailouts to other countries. And I wanted to connect to last week. Last week we heard about some of the environmental impacts of China's new global reach. And today I'm going to be talking about the economic impacts. And so there are these narratives: China's trapping countries in debt, it's offering bailouts, and it's sort of in competition with the IMF. And these narratives have been circulating in the press for quite a while, but I have at least two problems with them. The first is that the logic of China is going around offering bailouts isn't totally airtight. There's already just a little bit of tension between bailouts and debt trap diplomacy. I mean, why would you choose to be trapped over the IMF? But in particular, I think China's perspective is really caricatured and would benefit from a little deeper thinking. So going around bailing out countries is extremely expensive. It takes a lot of money to offer a financial firewall. So first of all, there are real economic costs to engaging this sort of behavior. There are also reputational costs. China works very hard to portray itself as, even though benefiting from decades of rapid economic growth, is still a member of the global South, as a champion of developing countries and not a member of the wealthy West. So they don't join things like the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. And if they develop a reputation as trapping countries, that's really going to undercut that message. And finally, we do see China just simply refusing to bail countries out. So something is missing here. How China decides who to lend to and who not to. I think it's usually overlooked that China might refuse to bail a country out. So this leads into my argument that China's willingness to bail you out depends on what you can offer it in return. And the most reliable thing that you can offer in return is natural resource exports. It's well known that China is seeking to secure access to natural resources. And I think part of the first generation of work on China's global footprint done by Deborah Brautigam and others was providing some important context that this is not a insidious new practice. Japan actually did the same thing when China was just getting developed. Western banks also offer resource secured loans. But it's true, this is a big part of China's dynamic with developing countries. If you are resource poor, sometimes you can offer China diplomatic favors, but you're not always going to be in a position to do something that China would like. But in testing this argument, we run into the second problem, which is sort of a lack of rigorous evidence that China is providing bailouts. Again, really, most of our understanding is still sort of at the journalistic level, and that's important. It's the first draft of history, but anyone who has, written multiple drafts of anything knows how much an argument can change. So it gives us the idea, and in specific cases might be able to confirm that, yes, this is what's going on, but it's not ideal for testing. So if you look only at instances of bailouts, we don't know. Maybe the country, and therefore countries deciding not to go to the IMF, maybe the countries that do go to the IMF have just as many loans from China. So there could even not be a correlation there. If you do want to go check that if there's a correlation, there's been incomplete data. So China does not publish at a sort of country level, at a country year level, their loans to developing countries. And furthermore, even if you could have that data and you found a correlation, it can be tough to decide that, yes, okay, this is causal. It's because of these Chinese loans that these countries are not going to the IMF. And my key contribution is trying to overcome both of these problems, more the second problem. A group of researchers, I believe mostly at Harvard, have made a big contribution in overcoming the data problem. They're building on work by folks at William and Mary, at Boston University, and elsewhere. And by tracking the total stock of a country's debt to China, we can also then back out a flow. We can check if they're actually paying down their debt to China. So a problem with maybe just relying on aid data is you would see loans coming in, but you don't know if it's just rolling over debt or if it's an expansion. You don't know what's getting repaid. And another real advantage is that this is publicly available at the country year level, which the World Bank's data reporting system is not. I did actually secure access to a slice, and I was able to validate some of this. They seem to track relatively closely, except for 2011 and 2012 when they really disagreed. I'm sure there's some measurement error here, but I think it's the best we have. I should note that the IMF has responded to Horn, Reinhardt, and Trebish's work. Their critiques are, well, maybe not all of this money is dispersed, and maybe not all of it is publicly guaranteed. I'm not too worried about either of those critiques because, particularly if you're facing balance of payments problems, sometimes just knowing that the money is there, whether you end up tapping it or not, is important. And secondly, the original paper says that a problem with the IMF's data is that they only look at very clearly publicly guaranteed loans. So say a loan made to a state-owned company, and that company's debt is not publicly guaranteed, the IMF wouldn't count that. And I believe that it is important to count that, that's an important source of credit. So from this, I can arrive at my explanatory variable, which is the change in a country's debt position to China scaled by GDP. And there are at least 103 countries that borrow from China at least once during the period for which we have data, which is 2001 to 2016. Now, with this data, we have to try to establish causality, that it's because of these Chinese loans that they are not turning to the IMF. And this is a slightly technical section, and I hope that we're able to have a substantive discussion. I think that's a real value of this forum, but it's core to what I'm doing, so I'm going to take 1 minute to walk through it. If you want to prove causation, you need randomness in the cause, because then you can say, well, we know that this cause isn't associated with anything else. So when we see changes in the outcome, it's definitely because of that. That's how an experiment works, right? In the social sciences, we very rarely, especially at this sort of macro level, we very rarely encounter experiments. But the next best thing is what's called an instrumental variable, which there's something else that is injecting a degree of randomness into the cause, into, in this case, Chinese loans. And with that, you can at least shed some light on the true causal effect of Chinese loans. So my proposition here is that on aggregate, China's loans are driven by processes internal to China, independent of Pakistan's relationship with the IMF, of Mozambique's relationship with the IMF. Every one of those individual loans has to do with that, may have to do with that country's relationship with the IMF. But overall, it's somewhat exogenous to that relationship. It has to do with China's foreign exchange reserves. It has to do with China's global ambitions. And these are sort of first movers. So this is what's known as the first stage. I'm using loans to other countries to proxy China's willingness and ability to make loans to a specific country. Now, someone with econometric training will look at this, and to them, it will resemble sort of an MC Escher staircase, you know, that closed loop of a staircase, where on paper, you can follow every step, but your gut tells you in the real world, this isn't possible. You know, you can't make something from nothing. And because I want to stay focused on the substance and the results, I'm going to ask you to trust me that I've verified this with simulations and worked out an analytic solution. And as long as what are known as confounders that are not controlled for are on average 0, it can work. And what that means, again, is that the aggregate changes in China's lending to the developing world are driven by processes internal to China. That's what that means. I do control for each country's sort of identity. We don't want to be comparing across countries. That's usually a pretty risky way to prove something. So we're comparing within countries over time. I also control for the US federal funds rate, because that is sort of the key valve of liquidity for the whole global economy. So when the rate is low, you're going to see lots of money, even just from private banks, flowing to the developing world searching for a return. And when it's higher, it might come back to the United States. Another concern might be, well, there's a commodity boom and a bust in this period, so maybe demand is somewhat correlated across countries, and it changes over years. So we're also going to control for a country's lagged GDP growth. What this setup gets us is we can actually answer the question, what's the effect of Chinese loans on a country's probability of going to the IMF? So here are the two stages. And the numbers that drop out of a lot of subtract, multiply, add, divide are these. And let me just interpret them real quick for you. This is a linear probability model. So it's estimating, it's predicting the absolute probability that a country participates in a new IMF program. And a 1% GDP loan from China predicts a 6 percentage point probability of decrease, lower probability of participating in an IMF program. So it's not 6% lower. The relative risk is going to vary for every country, but in this sample, about 10% of country years involve a new IMF program. So if we take that sort of average as our typical country, this is like a 60% reduction in the probability that they turn to the IMF. So first cut at the answer, does China offer bailouts? Yes. But I hope no one leaves this talk and goes around saying, oh, it reduces the probability by 6 percentage points. This is a very uncertain estimate, as you can see by the standard error. It could be as low as, lowering it by 1 or 2%, or maybe 10 percentage points, or as high as 10 percentage points. But we can be pretty sure that it's lowering it. The p-value, if you're attentive to those, is 0.02. But let's cut a little bit deeper. If we divide countries by those that, on average, they average at least $1.5 billion of natural resource exports, which is oil, gas, ores, and minerals. If we take those countries and we fit the model just for them, we get a much larger estimate. And the remaining countries have a much smaller one. So getting a loan from China really pushes down the likelihood that a resource exporter turns to China, much more than for other countries. The second finding is this F statistic. What it's doing is it actually talks about how well China's loans to other countries is predictive of loans to that country. It's much weaker here and very large here. So what that means is that, right, we have these internal underlying processes where there are rises and falls in China's lending to developing countries. Non-resource exporters are much more elastic. If it's a good year, it'll probably be really good there. If it's a bad year, maybe hardly anyone's getting a loan. But resource exporters can reliably get a loan from China. Because we're cutting the sample into 1/3 and 2/3, the estimates are going to be even more uncertain than before. So again, take these numbers with a large grain of salt. If you futz around, the numbers change. If we don't control maybe for the funds rate or GDP, I think it was GDP growth, to just bring some observations back in, we have sort of -10 and -2. So we're confident maybe that the effect is larger for resource exporters, but we're not very confident on exactly what the effect is. But that's okay. We just want sort of the first principles here. Yes, China's bailing countries out, and the effect seems to be strongest for countries that export a lot of natural resources. And finally, a little bit of observational evidence that yes, these are actually bailouts, comes from taking all the large loans. I inevitably drew the line somewhat arbitrarily. What is a large loan? I think I defined it as 0.9% of GDP. Why 0.9? I think as I was going through this the first time, there were a lot of like 0.98, 0.95, and I was like, that's basically a 1% GDP, 1% of GDP loan from China. So let's just bring in a few more. There are 273 of those. There have been 273 times that China has made a loan to a country at least 0.9% of its GDP. That's a big loan. Now, what I did was, for each of those country years, I looked 5 years in the past and 5 years in the future. I looked at its economic growth and its current account, and I averaged them. Those are the black dots you see on the screen. The trends already are suggestive that these loans are coming in bad times. GDP growth is trending down, current account is trending down. And actually the drop is particularly large from -1 to 0. So it's in a bad year, you go borrow from China. But we still want to compare. We want to have something to compare to. We don't want to assume that on average, the trend's totally flat. I mean, the world is an ever-changing place. So what we can do is, well, let's take 273 country years at random, completely random from the data set, and do the same thing. And then we do that 100 times, and we average the averages. That will give us a very clear idea of just what is this, what is the world of developing countries? What does their macroeconomic profile look like in the data set? And those are the open circles. And that should increase our confidence even further that China is lending to countries that start out doing better than average, but then come across hard times, harder than average times. And that's when they borrow from China. So that's enough tables and graphs. Finally, I want to talk about what this looks like in the real world. So really the first case that got the world's attention of this was Angola in 2004. They were in talks with the IMF. Ultimately, they secured a large loan from China and declined to start a new IMF program. And there was a lot of hullabaloo, and I'll again refer to Deborah Baudigan, provided some very important context to this, that actually Western banks also made loans to Angola at the same time. And if you look at Angola's history since then, there have been increases in transparency, which was a sticking point in negotiations with the IMF. And you can read Lucy Corkin's book about African agency, about what Angola has been able to do for itself in these negotiations. But bottom line, I think it's true that the huge rise in resource-motivated Chinese lending has increased the supply of credit for oil exporters, resource exporters. So even if these countries already had an easier time, maybe borrowing from someone other than the IMF, it's gotten even easier with the boom from China. An example of, not exporting large amounts of resources and not receiving a bailout is Zimbabwe. They have received loans from China. They were a diplomatic ally of China in Africa. The relations go back many decades. But when Zimbabwe approached China specifically for help with balance of payments, it was turned down. And two leaders, Mugabe, and then I lost my pronunciation guide for the current leader's name, but they were declined, and ultimately did have to go to the IMF. It was their first program in at least 20 years. They started a staff monitor program last year. It's already off track, and in a sort of funny, where are they now? They're trying to get money out of the United Arab Emirates, but I don't know if they're going to have very much luck there. Now, the off diagonal is equally interesting. There are resource exporters that don't get bailed out. Mongolia is an excellent example of this. It's the complete reverse of Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe went to China, asked for a bailout. China said, no, thank you. When Mongolia had some balance of payments problems in 2016, according to the sort of financial press, China went to Mongolia and tried to work out a deal. And Mongolia declined and instead started an IMF extended fund facility. And this fits with a principle of Mongolia's foreign policy, which is their third neighbor policy. So Mongolia is sandwiched between two giants, Russia and China. And the third neighbor policy says that Mongolia is going to work hard to maintain relations with countries that it doesn't share a border with. So it won't find itself just sandwiched between the two larger countries. Finally, we see countries that don't average large amounts of exports, of resource exports, but still receive a bailout. And a very recent example is Sri Lanka. They actually have been participating in extended fund facility since 2016, but they've been missing their targets and they have to get waivers. And they're having trouble implementing the reforms the IMF wants, and they still have balance of payments problems. And one of China's core policy banks, the China Development Bank, has been a key source of support for resolving these problems. And this is just sort of intuition. Sri Lanka did not offer a very clear quid pro quo. I think in Asia, it can be true that China makes loans for this nebulous idea of influence. I think outside of Asia, China still makes loans for favors, but they're sort of one shot. You know, you have a card, like maybe flipping your recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. And you can play that to get some loans, but then you're out. Or Greece very notably vetoed the European Union's condemnation of China's human rights record in the same year that it was receiving investment and I believe also loans from China. But it's in Asia that maybe China's strategic interests are stronger, and they'll be willing to help out for something that's less clear in return. And this is common to every great power. You know, France was particularly well disposed towards West Africa in the 90s and 80s, shielding them from IMF pressure. The US bailed out Mexico in 1994 because it's a neighbor and our economies are very tightly linked. But then just a few years later, when the Asian financial crisis hit, was suddenly very concerned about debt in Korea. And then it was actually the Japanese, who are close and have tight links with Korea, that were pushing for a bigger program. My final sort of caveat on the Sri Lanka case is they may actually still ultimately continue working with the IMF. And that's because something the IMF offers that China cannot is a stamp of credibility that Western banks will use to decide, okay, I think this country's on the right track. It's safe to make loans to them. It's a very clear signal of fiscal responsibility. But I think it is true that Sri Lanka has been able to put off implementing IMF-mandated reforms over the past 2 years because of help from the China Development Bank. So just wrapping up, I think we have strong evidence that China does offer bailouts, but they're not available to everyone. China's just not walking around tossing money at everyone. And that makes sense. That was my initial motivation, that caricature just didn't make sense from China's perspective. So who does get the bailouts? The most reliable way is to be able to guarantee them with natural resource exports. Maybe you can get diplomatic favors if you're in Asia, such as Mongolia or Sri Lanka, or if you are a Latin American country that is flipping its recognition to the PRC. But that's a little bit less reliable. So this is work in progress. I would like to look at IMF program outcomes, but doing that rigorously is much harder. There's selection problems. I would like to go much deeper with my qualitative process tracing. I think that's an area where maybe the audience could help me with their expertise, or even putting me in contact with various officials at the IMF or some of these countries. And I really look forward to your questions. And I just want to draw attention to my email down at the bottom in case you want to have maybe a one-on-one talk after this is done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Great presentation. A lot of rich information here. Folks in the audience, please go to the small Q&A box that you see there and put in a question. I see some people are putting some things in the chat. I'll try to catch some of those, but it's better to put them in the Q&A box and introduce yourself beforehand. Let me start with a question from Mir Alkan, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University and a postdoctoral fellow here in the Global China program. He asks, James, have you considered alternative instrumenting strategies that use only loans to a basket of similar countries? For example, a weighted basket based on region, economy, natural resource endowment, etc. This could improve the strength of your instrument. Also, he says, does your Mongolia example suggest that national concerns about security or overdependence on China is an important variable that should be considered as a control. We have Minghao Chiu from MIT, who asks, if the idea of using an aggregated loan as an independent variable to loan to an individual country is that the aggregated loan depends more on China's internal shocks than there is any other possibility. Have you had any luck of using some of China's internal shocks as independent variables? Benjamin Kreutzfeldt, great to hear from you, Ben, says, there are decision makers behind applications for funding, both at the IMF and at China banks, as well as countries seeking bailouts. Have you been able to interview such decision makers? Might this help understand whether A, loan bailout seekers prefer one institution or another, or B, IMF is discouraging applications from certain countries? We know that Trump's US has leaned on multilaterals to cut funding to certain countries for political reasons. Why don't we start with those, or I'll throw one more on, since these are more some of them are methodological questions. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about why you only specifically chose whether a country has a lot of resource exports to China, in sort of theories about what makes countries invest in other countries. There's usually three things that folks try to test on. One is to what extent do you rely on that country for imports? Another one is to what extent is a particular country have a large market that you want to export to? And the third one is to what extent is a country an export platform where your firms can go to another country, say Mexico, and re-export into the United States. And I wonder if looking at those three lenses in addition to resources, rather than just doing resources versus everything else, might help get a little bit closer to what some of these causalities might be. So why don't we take those cluster of four? Those of you in the audience, please go into the Q&A and add some more. We should be able to do a round or two of questions. Take it away, James.
Well, let me just say that I don't think I heard anything that I disagree with on the instrumental variables approach. I think that's a frontier, is checking other instruments, and the more of them that we try and we see, again, roughly similar, at least effects in the same direction, the more confident we can be. I'll say that a lot of my time and energy has been taken up actually justifying this. I myself at first thought this couldn't possibly work. And in fact, there is a recent article in the top methodology journal saying they can't work, but I know that they can. At first, just through simulations, I could prove it to myself. And I've worked out this sort of analytic answer, and ultimately that's sort of just a side methodological project. So just getting here took a lot of thinking. But now that I am here, I think these are good ideas on how to move forward. Both the weighted basket, potentially internal shocks. I mean, you could even just say, before and after Belt and Road, because yes, China was lending, but then there was a real spike up in 2015. And I like Mir's idea of controlling for dependence, because that does seem to be shaping decisions. As people are happy to tap China, but once you're in debt to them, do you want to go more in debt? That's a very good idea. Interviewing decision makers, I did speak to a loan officer at the China Development Bank, and he confirmed to me that, yeah, securing loans of natural resource exports is totally normal. But that's about the extent of the interviewing I've done. And as I said in my final slide, that's sort of where I want to go is, yeah, I've probed the sort of mechanisms and somewhat ground truth this with sort of financial press articles, but it would be much better to interview people. So again, any any connections or advice on cold calling people would be much appreciated. Finally, why resource exports? Of course, there are certainly other things that China cares about. And I actually, hinted at a second dimension, which is favors. A third one is probably trade. I guess an advantage of trade over favors actually is that's something where we have sort of hard data on. It's very gnarly to, in a principled way, divide countries that can do favors from those that can't. Part of the reason I chose resources was, first of all, just our qualitative knowledge that's a key factor, but also the ability to rigorously say, okay, we know that these countries are resource exporters and those are not. Trade we could do the same thing. Next batch.
Whoops, sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, James. What do we have here? We have one from Nick Lowe from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Great to see you here, Rick. Nick says, thanks for sharing this research. Your reference to Western banks' earlier use of resource for credit arrangements raises the question of how different Western and Chinese development finance models actually are in practice with respect to more equitable and inclusive environmental and social outcomes / governance. Put another way, what are your thoughts on how an increased understanding and awareness of the realities of Chinese development finance will affect the prevailing geopolitical narrative of big bad China, as he says? Carol Kong from the Sun Yat-sen University says, thank you, James, very interesting research. What would you recommend for a country in crisis to go to, China or the IMF for help? Let's see what I have in the chat. Here's one from Rebecca Ray here at the GDP Center. Whoops, she's got two. Why not include agricultural exports as well as mineral, especially since the Trump-Xi trade conflict picked up? China has been seeking agricultural imports. I know obviously your data goes till 2016, but if you extended it, that would be interesting. She also asks, on the qualitative mechanisms, the shifting balance among favors / resources / influence. Check out Deborah Brodigam's The Dragon's Gift for a intra-Africa look at the different relationships with resource and non-resource exporting countries. I guess I'll throw one more in there, and then this can be your last round, and so add with any concluding thoughts that you might have. A lot of the scholars that put in political science and economics that do a lot of work on the IMF as opposed to China, that literature largely finds that IMF loans are largely correlated with favors, with Western powers, especially the United States, preferences in the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council, or Western Europe. And then when you look at the outcomes, a lot of the econometric literature finds that IMF programs tend to exacerbate health and inequality problems, and there's a somewhat limited impact on economic growth. And so as I see that literature and look at your paper, I just wonder what your thoughts might be on how to look at these two, right? If you're a developing country, now you have another option. And it'd be interesting to see if in further work, what you're finding is that there's some evidence that that China can displace the International Monetary Fund with respect to short-term liquidity, emergency finance, which might be a good thing given that the outcomes, most of the literature finds that the outcomes of the IMF versions don't lead to such great outcomes, but remains to be seen about the extent to which the Chinese finance leads to better outcomes. You alluded to one possible one there is a correlation between an IMF loan and being able to re-enter capital markets quicker. It'll be interesting to see if you find that, if folks would find that. There is one anecdotal story about that where in 2008, 2009, when Ecuador partially defaulted on its loans, it went to China instead of the International Monetary Fund. And it did such a good job of paying China back at the time that Moody's upgraded their credit rating, and they were able to go back to capital markets quick, which is just one piece, one data point in a larger story. But I think I encourage folks out there who are doing this kind of research. So we've got this whole body of work on the IMF, and now these very interesting findings on the CDB. Be interesting to see if the CDB prompts different outcomes. Thanks, James. Please respond to that cluster. Make any closing remarks you might have.
Sure. These questions reminded me that I think the one slide I stumbled over a little bit was at the very beginning, just setting up the background that if China is making bailouts, there are different ways of interpreting the significance of that. So yes, Chinese critics say that China is bending countries to its will. And with regards to the IMF, they're undercutting an institution that's providing an important public good. But you could also say that because the IMF has such a dubious track record, it might be good that China is breaking this sort of Western cartel of creditors. And if you are someone who cares about the IMF specifically, you could say, yeah, this is clearly an Atlantic-dominated institution. And the only way, and they're not going to give up power willingly. The only way to do that is with pressure. And maybe this will force the EU and the US to finally share a little bit of power with China. Interesting fact is that the headquarters of the IMF is supposed to be in the world's largest economy. So there will come a day when technically it's supposed to decamp to Beijing. We'll see if that ever happens. Where do I come down on this? Right. So this is the gotcha question, where I'm going to establish my reputation as a hawk or a dove. I don't think China behaves that differently from any other country. I guess I think they're just as bad as the West for many things. Maybe not on sort of environmental and labor issues. I'm going to bracket that, but just on the idea of balance of payments assistance for favors, you can find so many examples. Ones that I know particularly well are the US and Egypt in the 90s, and again, France in the African franc zone. David Sassavich's dissertation, actually, which became his first book, is like really excellent on that. The way that there was this sort of Africa lobby in Paris that enjoyed having close relationships with those leaders, and they made sure they got all the francs they needed to import champagne from Paris. And then it's just sort of a funny story about how they bureaucratically, surprisingly, were no longer in office. And the new prime minister came in and said, why are we spending all this money on these countries that haven't been our colonies for a long time? And they were just cut off. And they all had to go to the IMF. Who I recommend to go to? So we have to reverse, right? So first I'm looking at it depends on what your problems are and what your preferred solution is. So I think, are there any rules of thumb that I could give here? If maybe my rule of thumb is who your big buddy is, who your big brother is. So maybe if you can get the United States to cut you a softer deal with less conditionality than the IMF, you should go there. If the United States doesn't like you very much and potentially the IMF would drive a very hard bargain, it might be better to go to the IMF. Final clarification on that actually is political scientists are usually very cold, and we might just say, well, what's best for the leader? How is the leader going to stay in power? And then maybe it's best to go to China to now do the reforms. But another perspective, equally important, is what's best for the people. And on that, I don't have a clear answer. Let's see. So Rebecca and Kevin's questions. My notes are not good enough to remind me of the gist. Kevin, could you just give me like a one line on each?
Sure. Becky's question was, why not include agricultural exports as well as minerals, especially given the Trump-Xi trade conflict? China has really been had a shortage of agricultural imports and has had to go look elsewhere for agricultural imports, since the United States was such a big source of that.
Okay.
And I had just made a comment more about linking your work to the broader literature on the IMF, which you sort of answered, right? Most of the econometric literature says that the IMF loans are A, largely politically tied, and B, the pro-cyclical nature of their sort of fiscal consolidation programs have largely been found in the literature to have negative economic outcomes, negative social outcomes, and you speak to the first part, right? China, you're finding some evidence that China offers another alternative where you don't get the conditional loans, but we're not yet at the outcomes part. So if to answer the question about what you would choose, who would you choose? The evidence, it's hard, you got to be a little careful. The evidence isn't there yet, right? We know that IMF programs come at a heavy cost, but sometimes it's your only choice. What you're finding now is that there's actually more choice, but we don't know what the costs and benefits are yet. A lot of that has unfolded. There hasn't been rigorous work, but we've got to encourage you to go do that piece.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's advice to keep moving forward in answering more questions. I am definitely fighting the temptation to just sort of be perfectionist about this and keep refining and refining and refining. But I think it would be very good to solutional piece, and that there might be more rewards to moving more quickly on that. Finally, on why not agriculture, I guess my answer is that I think that matters, but it probably doesn't matter enough to cut through the noise. Cobalt or copper are only in a few places. I mean, if you want copper, you sort of have to be doing business with Chile almost, right? Agriculture, I think China is trying to diversify. So I'm not sure that it would come down to like, okay, we're going to stake $1 billion on just securing access to this. Let's see, I know my understanding is that China is looking to the Americas for food security, actually. Deborah Browdingham's name has come up again and again because she's such a titanic figure in this field. She has a book called Will Africa Feed China? Another work with a yes or no title. And actually her answer is more no. And instead they're doing things like buying Smithfield in this country for pork, and buying other things from Brazil. So I think that, like trade, I think that's another thing that matters. But sort of in hierarchy, I would guess it goes something like favors the top, then trade, then agriculture. And the finer slice, the tougher it is to say definitive about that. I got to note my connection was unstable. Is everything, you hear that okay?
Yeah, a little gurgly, but we got it. Hey, well, thanks, James, and thanks everybody out there for coming. You're all invited back here this afternoon if you want to talk about the political economy of infrastructure in Latin America. Tomorrow morning, we're really excited at 9:30 to launch a new freely downloadable database of Chinese equity in global and loans in global power plants around the world. And next week, James started talking about China and Latin America. We'll have a conversation about China, Latin America from one of our other fellows, Victoria Chon from the University of Southern California, and also a fellow here at the GDP Center. So please go to our website, www.edu/GDP. Go to the events drop down. You can see and sign up for these events. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, James. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you at some of these other venues. Have a great day.